Pauline Pillay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, it's a pleasure to stand and speak in support of this bill, and I want to join many colleagues from all sides of the House in congratulating Rick Barker, because indeed the drafting of this bill was done under the former Labor government, and without being perhaps not being churlish, but it is a pity perhaps that this bill didn't come forward. It could have been in the raft of bills that were rushed through in urgency when the government first came into office, and I think this bill would have been far more effective than many of the bills that were passed through at that time, Mr Speaker. But as I said, Labor is supporting this bill, mainly because, not only because, but because Labor actually drafted the bill. And we want to see, one of the things that is missing, however, from the bill that Labor drafted is that an overarching agency with responsibility for fines. There is no provision for it in the legislation, and like other members, I welcome the bill going to Select Committee, to the hard-working Justice and Electoral Select Committee, I think. No, Law and Order Select Committee. With that relatively hard-working Select Committee, not quite as hard-working as Justice and Electoral, of course, but going to the Select Committee where, as former members have said, the public will be able to make submissions, and the bill will be given very careful scrutiny, because indeed I think it amends some at least 20 pieces of legislation, Mr Speaker, and I know that with the hard-working support of the staff of the Select Committee, and indeed of officials, that often extra bits are picked up during that process to enable the bill, that when it is enacted, to work effectively. So, as I said, Mr Speaker, that this bill is certainly long overdue, and that we on this side of the House do support it. I just wanted to, because basically the bill introduces the driver licence stop orders proposal, and that we've seen in other countries, predominantly, if I can use Australia as an example, that it has increased the success rate of collecting fines. Now, if I can just pause and look at what these fines are, that if we look at between July 2008 and June 2009, the courts wiped $95 million in fines, and that was of the total $806 million in unpaid fines. So that amount being wiped is absolutely substantial, and also given the large and growing amount of outstanding penalties, because as we're all aware, if fines aren't paid, then of course the penalties mount up, and it becomes a ever-decreasing circle for the offender. So the effectiveness of those monetary penalties as a sanction become eroded, because it almost becomes impossible if the fine's not paid and as the penalties mount for offenders to look at paying them. So also, if you look at the amount of unpaid fines which were remitted to community work, it's more than tripled over the last 5 years, from $16.6 million in 2005 to $55.7 million last year. So when we're talking about substantial monies, Mr Speaker, and those monies, it's very important that we get them retrieved. I want to talk briefly about some of the amendments to acts, and Part 1 amends the District Courts Act of 1947, and that's to allow deductions to be made from wages and benefits to pay debts, and indeed aiming to streamline this enforcement process by enabling judgment creditors to file a financial statement to enable deductions to be made. Now this, Mr Speaker, obviously is of assistance in terms of getting the money, but it is also of assistance to someone who is in trouble. If those fines, and there is a process for paying off those fines, then obviously there isn't going to be an escalation of penalties for the offender, which, just as I said before, just escalate the problem of payback. The second is the amendments to the Land Transport Act of 1998, and that's authorising driver licence stop orders, and that's a new enforcement measure, and that, as I spoke about before, is successful, and it will allow for the suspension of drivers' licences when they have not made any arrangements to pay overdue traffic penalties. So under this new measure, that liable persons would be sent a warning notice, so there is that warning, and giving them 14 days to resolve those problems, those penalties, before the suspension of their licence. And then if that doesn't happen, then the driver licence stop orders would suspend all drivers' licences held by people in default, and that would include limited licences. So they're pretty tough. It is actually getting quite tough. There is the warning. You've got to get that people, not you, Mr. Speaker, certainly not you, Mr. Speaker, but that offenders do have to get that, they have those 14 days to get those penalties paid, but if that doesn't happen, then the regime is able to be followed through. And that following the, if I can call it the DLSO, the driver's licence stop order, following that suspension, until all the overdue traffic penalties are resolved through payment, or if there is in fact a negotiated or agreed payment agreement, then those orders stay in place. If a person drives in breach of that order, then their vehicle will be impounded for 28 days. So there are behavioural consequences. There's some clarity in terms of how to get the penalties paid, to either pay them or enter into an agreement, and if you breach them, then there will be actions taken against offenders. Part 3 is also in terms of the amendments to the Summary Proceedings Act of 1957, and there is also, if I can talk also about streamlining the infringement system, and that's where the Act will be amended to improve the operation of the infringement system and the court collection and enforcement processes by addressing inconsistencies that are already in place and increasing the operational efficiency and the flexibility. And that, Mr. Speaker, in terms of that operational efficiency and flexibility is going to be very, very positive. So it's not all draconian. It's certainly not draconian. It is actually enabling offenders to take responsibility for their actions, and at the same time not be have mounting debt because they face up and get that debt paid off. So. As I said before, it is a pity that the single agency to have responsibility for fines, that isn't in place, and it'll be interesting to see that if it is within scope, that perhaps some amendments can be made. But history has shown us, and I think the Ministry of Justice research shows that when people cross a certain threshold of money owed, and that's around $2,000 for a young person, they become unwilling and unable to even attempt paying off those fines. Now that, Mr. Speaker, is a lose-lose. There are no winners in that, and if we can address this matter and we can get those fines begin to being paid off, then it's going to obviously be of an advantage to the offender, because they're not going to have debt mounted just escalating, and obviously it's going to be of advantage in terms of the justice coffers in terms of getting that money. So, Mr. Speaker, along with my colleagues, I just like to say again congratulations to Rick Barker and congratulate even the national government, perhaps being a little tardy, but nonetheless in picking up this bill, and I'm very proud to